Boatworks Today is a viewer-supported show. To learn more on how you can get involved and watch extended ad-free versions of these videos, please visit our website, boatworkstoday.com, and click on the top of the heading where it says Support This Show. Thank you. So, welcome back everybody. I hope you are all having a wonderful week. My name is Andy with Boatworks Today. In this video, we're going to be taking a little bit of a sidestep from the fairing up around the Bertram. Mainly because, well, I'm still fairing. It's not done. I think I'm on round 4 or 5 right now. And, well, I don't want to post that video until it's actually finished. So that'll be coming up next weekend. And for folks over on Patreon, that will be coming up on Monday afternoon. But for this video, again, like I said, taking a little bit of a sidestep, I wanted to kind of do some testing and experimenting, I guess, to address a question that I've been getting consistently over and over the years. And my typical answer when I get that question, or I guess there's 2 variations of the similar question, but my typical response is, I don't know. I don't know. I've never tried it, never tested it. So generally speaking, the question that I get revolves around folks asking if they can use a particular product in a way that it really wasn't designed to do. And I guess more specifically is that, you know, people will say, okay, well, since gelcoat is essentially it's a polyester-based resin that just has some pigment in it, can I use gelcoat for wetting out fiberglass? I don't know. I've never tried it. It's certainly not something that's commonly done. And then the other question is typically something along the lines of, well, you know, I'm trying to get some glass laid up, and it's, you know, a little cold, so because of the temperature, I'm kind of limited to being able to use epoxy. But because it's so cold, the epoxy, it's a little thick. It's hard to get it work into the glass. So since penetrating epoxy is a much thinner viscosity, can I use penetrating epoxy instead of like a traditional 2-to-1 or 5-to-1, and will that work? And again, I'm like, I don't know. Never tried it. So today I'm going to be doing 4 different layups. The first one being we're going to try it with some penetrating epoxy, and then also as a kind of like a base, we've got their Total Boat, their 2-to-1 epoxy, and then some laminating polyester resin, as well as some unwaxed gel coat. So we're going to do 2 layers of 1708 for each product, and let it go, put it to bed overnight, and see what happens. See how well it works into the fabric, how well it sets up, how stiff it is. You know, does it want to kind of separate? I don't know. Again, next time I get this question, I want to be able to give an answer. So the first resin I'm going to try is going to be the penetrating epoxy. Now, typically, this is a resin, you know, that I would use, say, if I was going to be pre-coating some lumber, like if I was going to be doing some varnish work, or if I was dealing with, again, some type of a board that had some, you know, like knots, little pinholes, basically something that's more so wood-based. Honestly, I've never heard of it being used with a fiberglass reinforcement. But it is definitely thin. I mean, it's not water thin, but it's pretty darn thin. And I should say that personally, again, not having tried this, I don't have real high hopes that this is going to work out real well. I think it's definitely going to wet out pretty easy. But beyond that, I'm not quite sure what's going to happen. So 1 down, again, that wetted out super easy. And on the second layup, I'm going to be using the Total Boat. It's their 2-to-1. So this is going to be kind of my baseline, I guess, between this and the penetrating epoxy. Again, I suspect there's going to be a night and day difference tomorrow morning, but we'll see. All right, so let's see. I did 6 pumps of that. That's thinner. I'm going to try 4, 5, 6 pumps. Because this is a thicker epoxy, I'm going to pre-coat the underside here just to help it work into the glass a little easier. Again, I'm doing all these with the chop side of the 1708 facing down. And that's, generally speaking, that's how I lay up all my 1708. I always do chop side down. It's one of the things I like about 1708 is that it's one of those fabrics that you can use it with pretty much any kind of a resin, whether it's poly or epoxy, and it works fantastic. Now, I guess while I'm sitting here, whether you're just sitting here watching me tap the brush, answer kind of another question that commonly comes up, which is, well, 1708 has a chop strand backing on it. I think it's just like a light 3/4 ounce backing on it. Well, if you're not supposed to be using epoxy with chop strand matting, why can you use epoxy with 1708 then? And the answer for that is basically in how the chop strand matting is being, I guess, adhered to the actual biaxial. And so with typical chop strand matting, that's at least here in the United States, that's held together with a type of like a styrene-based binder. And whenever you wet that out with, say, like a polyester-based resin, which is cut with styrene, it melts that binder and makes the glass much more pliable. Well, epoxy doesn't contain any styrene, so it doesn't do that. What you end up getting stuck with is kind of like a cloudy, milky, I don't know, just kind of a royal pain of a wetted out fabric to deal with whenever you're trying to wet out chop strand matting with epoxy. Now with 1708, the chop strand, it's stitched in place. There is no binder used. It's just strictly, if you ever look at this material closely, you'll be able to see that there's an actual stitching, that's holding all the layers together. So that's the difference. 1708 does not contain any kind of a styrene-based binder in it on the chop strand side, whereas in typical chop strand matting, it does, at least for the fabric that's sold here in the U.S. Now, there is, over in Europe, there are companies that sell chop strand matting that uses a powder binder. And I guess that works really, really well. I have yet to be able to find someone in the U.S. here that carries it. I think it's mostly a European thing, but don't quote me on that. There may be a supplier here that I'm not familiar with. But that's typically where the confusion comes in, because you hear from people over across the pond saying, well, I use chop strand all the time with epoxy and it works great. Well, that's true. They're probably using the chop strand that's using the powder binder. So on this third layup, I'm going to be using laminating polyester resin. And this can has been sitting for a little while. And again, I say this over and over, but whenever you're dealing with a can of poly resin or vinyl resin that's been sitting for even as little bit as a day, give it a good shake. Get the solids in the resin, incorporated back into the main mix here. And with 4 ounces, I'm going to mix this a little less than 2.5 cc's. Which is going to give me a mix of about close to 2%, which I generally don't ever mix poly resin more than 2%. I suppose if you're, it's just not a good idea. Generally, it's mixed between 1 and 2%. Hot weather makes it closer to 1. Cooler temperatures, like right here I'm in 65, which is kind of borderline the minimum temp for working with polyester resin. Then you can kind of bump it up a little bit closer to 2, but I really kind of shy away from trying to go much higher than that. At least the plastic that I have here, this is just regular household siding plastic. There are plastics that will hold up to the styrene in polyester-based resins. This is not one of them. So I'm fully expecting the plastic on here to kind of wrinkle and pucker a little bit. So tomorrow morning when I pull this off, it's not going to look as nice and clean and flat as the epoxy-based, and that would be the reason why. And last but not least is going to be some just good old-fashioned laminating gel coat. Laminating gel coat is essentially a gel coat that does not have any wax in it. And again, because it is a polyester-based material, the old shaky. Now honestly, this is going to be the one that I'm going to be most curious about, because I swear that I've seen manufacturing videos. I think they were specifically more along the lines of like doing hot tubs and that kind of thing. I don't know what kind of resin they were using when they were doing their hand layups, but it sure looked like gel coat. But they never said. I don't know. All I know is that using gel coat isn't something that I've ever really seen or heard of. Again, I get the question quite a bit, but I don't know of anybody that uses it. But when you think about it, I guess I don't really see any reason why it wouldn't work. So there again, I'm going to pre-coat for the first layer of 1708. I mean, I believe I mentioned this earlier. I'm not 100% positive. It's been a long day. But my understanding, and again, I'm not the chemist. All I know is what I've read and kind of my experience with it. But from my understanding is that gel coat is essentially just somewhat thickened, pigmented polyester resin. So, like I said, on paper it sounds like it might work. I'm not saying that you should do this, but on paper it sounds like it could work, which is why I'm so curious about trying this. Now, because this is a laminating gel coat, first thing tomorrow, and same with this sample as well. So first thing tomorrow morning, I'm going to come in and coat these with some PVA, just so that the glass itself can fully cure. So we're getting somewhat of a like-for-like comparison between the poly-based materials and the epoxies. So at this point, I'm pretty much on hold. I'm going to put these kids to bed for the night, and I'll see you tomorrow morning. Well, good morning. It's been about 3 hours since I put the PVA on these polyester samples. And while they may not be 100% cured, I think they're probably pretty close. Now, if you're not familiar, polyester resin is one of those resins that's used with fiberglass that in order for it to fully cure, it needs to have some sort of an air barrier put over the top. A lot of times you'll see polyester resin offered 2 different ways, either with wax or without. So if you're working with the material that actually has wax, what happens is that the wax floats up to the surface, creates that air barrier so that the polyester resin and everything beneath it can fully cure. The resin that does not contain any wax, you'll notice that it even after it's been 24, 48 hours or more, it still remains a little bit tacky, and that's because it's basically a laminating resin. So you're able to go right over top of that with some more material, whether it's the next day you're having to lay up some more glass or some gel coat or what have you. You're able to go right over top of that without having to do any sanding. Now, all of these samples have been basically put to bed for the last, well, it was about 6 o'clock last night, and it's about noon now. So it's as cured as it's going to get, at least this is as long as I'm going to wait for it to cure. So let's start peeling up these samples and just kind of see what we got. So I don't know if you can see this on here, but I've gone through and I've labeled each of these samples. Now, again, going over, this is the sample that was laid up using the penetrating epoxy. This was a sample with 2:1 epoxy, laminating poly resin, and then finally our gel coat. Now I'm going to go, I want to start with the penetrating epoxy because that's one actually I'm most curious about. So let's, okay. Well, it's definitely very flexible, it's soft. And I guess I'm not entirely surprised about that. I mean, penetrating epoxy is typically used on wood, whether it's a sheet good like plywood or actual lumber. So having a bit of flexibility is actually a good thing because wood expands and contracts. I mean, yes, wood movement is definitely a thing. So, I mean, you'd want to have an epoxy that can kind of move with the lumber as it's doing that. So so I guess what I'm saying here is that penetrating epoxy for glasswork, probably not the best. But for lumber, I think it would be it's the best option out there, in my opinion. So especially if you're looking to kind of pre-seal it, if you're going to be doing some build-up with some varnish work or anything like that, or even if you have some like imperfections in the wood, some knots, or maybe some woods that are some grain that's maybe it's starting to get a little bit of punk. You can, saturate that with the penetrating epoxy, and it'll stabilize everything so that the part won't come back to create problems down the road. I'm not going to give it a high score with glass, but stick to using it with lumber, and you'll be just fine. Now, the 2:1, considerably stronger. I mean, considerably stronger. Now, the Total Boat they have a 2:1 as well as a 5:1. Now, the 2:1 is has a little bit more flexibility than their 5:1. The 5:1 is really kind of what they generally speaking, and this is kind of an umbrella statement. But the 5:1 is generally what they recommend for doing composite work, working with fiberglass and that kind of thing. Whereas the 2:1, because it has a little bit more flexibility, it tends to be used a lot more often, say with wooden boats, you know, and that kind of thing. Again, because there's a lot of twisting and movement, and wood expands and contracts. So the 2-to-1 is typically used more so on wooden boats. You can certainly use it with composites. It's what I'm using on the Bertram here. But it's, compared to the penetrating epoxy, way, way stronger. All right, so moving over to laminating poly. Not as stiff as the 2-to-1 epoxy, still considerably stronger than the penetrating epoxy sample. But yeah, I mean, it's set up very, very nice. Now this one, again, this was kind of a like a base sample. Not very surprised at all by these results. What I am going to be curious to look at is the gel coat sample. Well, it did saturate. It worked its way through all the layer, you know, the 2 layers of 1708. And honestly, it feels about as stiff as the laminating poly. Interesting. Interesting. Honestly, I wasn't expecting that. Now, granted, I'm not a chemist, right? I don't know enough about the chemical composition as far as, you know, how well gel coat would actually work for, you know, in the long run for wetting out fiberglass. But, you know, I would say, you know, if you're going to be working on something that's more of like a cosmetic piece, if you happen to run out of laminating poly resin, you know, that's typically used, it might be all right to use that on a cosmetic piece. And gel coat, for the most part, is a cosmetic type material. I mean, it's usually a finishing material. I don't know that I would use it on any kind of a fiberglass repair where it's actually going to count or, you know, have to be important. Just because I don't have any experience with that. And I did some looking around online. I couldn't find anything. For the most part. I did come across a few sites that, and again, I don't know, you always got to kind of take everything with a grain of salt, whatever you find online. But, you know, I did find some sites that said that if you had to, you know, if you were running short, you can theoretically mix laminating poly resin and laminating gel coat. You can mix those together, catalyze it, and then use that for glasswork. I don't know that I would do that, and I certainly would not recommend that. I'm not saying that it's not true. I can't verify that. So there's quite a few people that follow this channel, and a lot of people that work in the industry, and some I know for a fact that work in more of like the chemist side of the marine industry. If there's anybody out there that actually has some firsthand like concrete knowledge on, you know, how well gel coat or something like that would actually work in conjunction with fiberglass or repair work, let me know down below. I guess I'd just be curious to hear what someone who is more familiar with that aspect of the product, hear what you have to say. So drop a comment down below. I would be curious to hear it, and I'm sure there's quite a few others that would as well. So on that note, I think I'm going to wrap this video up so I can jump back over on the Bertram and continue on with the fairing that needs to get done around that helm area. So I hope you enjoyed the video. I hope you found it informative. And if you did, hit that thumbs up button. If you have any questions, comments, leave those down below. If you're not already subscribed, hit that subscribe button and that little notification bell. That does make a difference. And as always, thank you for your time. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.
This has been a Boatworks Today production.